want to tell you about the moment I walked back through those doors. Not as an employee, not with a box of my things, not with a security escort, not with the particular kind of hollow numbness that follows public humiliation. I walked back through those doors 1 year and 11 days after the morning they showed me out of them. And this time, I had an attorney behind me and a signed letter of intent in a folder and the legal right to sit down at any desk in that building and call it mine. The receptionist at the front desk was the same one who had been there the day I left. Her name was Brianna. Young, always professional. One of those people who was good at her job in a way that had nothing to do with whoever happened to be running the place. She looked up when I came through the door, and I watched her face go through 3 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. Recognition, confusion, and then something that might have been the beginning of a smile, quickly contained because she was professional, and this was still technically a workday. She said, "Ms. Anna, it's good to see you." I said, "It's good to be back." And I meant it in every possible way. My name is Anna. I'm 30 years old, and I want to tell you about the year between the morning I stood on a sidewalk holding a cardboard box full of my own belongings, not entirely sure I was going to be okay, and the afternoon I signed my name to a document that made me the owner of the company that put me on that sidewalk. It is not a story about revenge. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because I know that's what it sounds like. It's a story about what happens when you refuse to let someone else's assessment of your value be the final word. About what becomes possible when the thing that was supposed to break you becomes the thing that focuses you so completely that you are, for the first time in your life, completely unreachable. Before I go any further, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea what you were actually capable of, if you've ever had to rebuild from a moment that felt like pure destruction, hit like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning. It's a Tuesday morning in March. My alarm didn't go off, and the entire course of my life is about to change because of 17 minutes. I had worked at Meridian Consulting for 3 years by the time any of this happened. 3 years is long enough to know a place completely. Not just the org chart and the official processes, but the real architecture underneath. Who actually makes decisions and who only thinks they do? Which rules apply to everyone, and which ones bend depending on who you are and how well you're liked on any given Tuesday. Where the fault lines run. What the place is actually made of when you press on it. Meridian was a mid-sized operations consulting firm. About 90 people, regional clients, a solid enough reputation built mostly on the work of a core group of people who had been there long enough to know what they were doing. I was brought in as a project manager, and over 3 years had worked my way into leading engagements. Real engagements. The kind where the client is paying serious money and expects serious results. I delivered them. I have the performance reviews to prove it, not that anyone asked. The problem wasn't the work. The work was fine. The work was, honestly, the only reason I stayed as long as I did. The problem was Victor Hale. Victor had been brought in as managing director about 18 months before I joined, and in that time, he had systematically converted what had apparently been a reasonably functional workplace into something that operated primarily on anxiety. He was the kind of leader who confused fear with respect and had no reliable way to distinguish between the two. His mood on any given morning dictated the entire emotional weather of the office. You learned quickly to read the signals, to adjust your behavior before he even spoke. to become very good at anticipating what version of him you were dealing with on any particular day. The favoritism was not subtle. There were people in that office who could miss deadlines, arrive late consistently, produce mediocre work, and receive nothing but patience and private encouragement. And there were people who could do everything right, quarter after quarter, and still feel the particular precariousness of knowing that their standing depended not on their output, but on something more arbitrary and less fair. I was in the second category. I had known it for a while. I had told myself it didn't matter as long as I kept doing good work. That was my first mistake. The belief that doing good work is always enough protection. In some workplaces, it is. In some workplaces, it is the only thing that matters. Meridian was not one of those workplaces. The culture of fear expressed itself in small ways that accumulated into something suffocating over time. Meetings where one person's mistake became everyone's lesson, conducted in front of the full team with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with improvement and everything to do with establishing who held the power. Emails CC'd strategically to create paper trails that served no operational purpose but established very clearly who was under scrutiny. The particular silence that fell over a room when Victor was displeased, a trained silence, learned through repetition, the kind that communicates that everyone present has made a collective decision to be invisible. I had survived 3 years of it by being useful enough that the cost of losing me outweighed the satisfaction of making my life difficult. I knew that calculation. I understood it clearly. And I also understood that it was not a stable equilibrium, that it depended entirely on me continuing to perform at a level that made me indispensable, and that one significant mistake, one project that didn't land, one morning where something went wrong that I couldn't control, The subway broke down on a Tuesday morning in March. Not my line specifically. A signal failure somewhere upstream that cascaded through 3 connecting lines and turned what should have been a 38-minute commute into something that took an hour and 12 minutes, during which I stood in a packed train car that wasn't moving, watching the minutes accumulate on my phone, sending a message to my assistant to let the team know I was delayed, and doing the mental math that told me I was going to be between 15 and 20 minutes late to the office. I was not the only one. I found out later that 11 other people from our office were on affected subway lines that morning. 11 people who arrived late for the same reason, with the same MTA service alert screenshot available to anyone who wanted to look it up. 11 people who received nothing more than a slightly tense morning. I was the 12th. Victor called me into his office at 10:15. Not immediately when I arrived. He let me get settled, let me start on my emails, let the morning begin to feel normal. And then his assistant appeared at my desk and said he'd like to see me. I knew before I stood up. I don't know how exactly, some combination of the way she said it and something in the air that morning, and 3 years of learning to read the signals. I knew when I picked up my notebook, and when I walked across the office, and when I saw, through the glass wall of his office, that there were 2 other people in the room. HR. Both of them, already seated. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Victor. The worst of it never involved raised voices. He spoke in a measured, almost regretful tone, as if what was happening pained him deeply, as if he were being forced into this by circumstances beyond his control. He said that punctuality was a foundational value at Meridian. He said that patterns of behavior, and he used that phrase, patterns of behavior, for 17 minutes on one Tuesday morning, could not be overlooked. He said that he needed people around him whom he could count on completely. I said, "The subway had a signal failure this morning. It's documented. 11 other people from this office were affected." He said, "I understand that, and I appreciate you explaining. But ultimately, the decision has been made." That was it. The decision has been made. Passive voice. No ownership. No specific allegation beyond the 17 minutes. Just a smooth, practiced sentence that landed and left nothing to argue with because it had been constructed specifically to leave nothing to argue with. They slid a single page across the desk. Termination of employment. Effective immediately. A small box of my personal items had already been assembled by someone, I still don't know who, and was sitting on the corner of his desk. They had packed it before he called me in. I signed the page. I picked up the box. I walked back through the office, which had gone very quiet, and I felt the particular weight of knowing that people were watching and deliberately not watching simultaneously. Some of them were my friends. None of them said anything. I understood why. I didn't blame them. The security guard, a man named Dan, who had always nodded at me in the mornings and who looked genuinely uncomfortable with the assignment he had been given, walked me to the elevator, and then to the lobby, and then to the front door. He held it open. He said, very quietly, "Take care of yourself." It was the kindest thing anyone said to me that day. I stood on the sidewalk outside the building with a cardboard box in my hands and a March wind coming off the street and absolutely no idea what to do with the next hour, let alone the next year. People walked past me in both directions, living their ordinary Tuesday, and I stood there in the middle of it and thought, okay, something has to happen now. I just don't know what. The shock lasted longer than I expected. I had been through hard things before. Everyone has. I thought I was reasonably resilient. I thought I had a realistic understanding of how setbacks worked and how long they took to process and what was required to move through them. I was wrong about all of that. Or at least, wrong about how it feels when the setback includes a significant dose of public humiliation. Because the job loss itself was manageable. Jobs end. That's a real thing that happens to real people, and there are established processes for dealing with it. What was harder to process was the memory of walking through that office with a box, of all those carefully averted eyes, of the way the whole thing had been staged for an audience. That part stuck. It played on a loop in the background of everything else for longer than I wanted it to. The practical problems arrived quickly, because practical problems don't wait for you to finish processing the emotional ones. I had savings, not as much as I should have had, but some. I started calculating how long I could manage my rent before something had to give. And the answer was less comfortable than I would have liked. I updated my resume the first week. I started sending applications the second. I was good at what I did. I had 3 years of solid project management experience in a specialized area, and I genuinely believed that finding something new would take 4 to 6 weeks at the outside. It took longer. Much longer. The market was tighter than it had been when I'd last looked for a job, and the particular sector I worked in, operations consulting for mid-market companies, was going through a period of contraction that nobody had explicitly told me about because nobody tells you those things until you're inside them. I sent 43 applications over 6 weeks. I had 12 responses. I had 4 first-round interviews. I had 1 second-round interview, from which I received a very polite email informing me that they had decided to move in a different direction. My friend Rachel, who had a 2-bedroom apartment and the particular generosity of someone who doesn't make a big deal about being generous, offered me her second room around week 5, when I had started doing the mental math that involved things like whether I could reduce my grocery spending by enough to meaningfully extend my runway. I said yes. Accepting it was harder than it should have been, because I had spent 3 years feeling like I was someone who had things figured out, and needing to crash in a friend's spare room challenged that self-image in ways I was not entirely prepared for. The lowest point came on a Thursday afternoon in early May. I was sitting at Rachel's kitchen table with my laptop open to a job board, and I was looking at a posting for a position that was 2 levels below what I had been doing at Meridian and paid 30% less, and I was thinking seriously about applying for it. And something about the combination of those facts, where I was and where I had been, and how much distance existed between them, landed on me all at once. Not dramatically, just heavily. I closed the laptop, and I put my head down on my arms, and I stayed like that for a while. Rachel came home around 6. She didn't ask what was wrong. She made dinner. She's a better cook than she gives herself credit for. And she set a plate in front of me and sat down across from me and said, "You're not done." I know it doesn't feel like that right now, but you're not done. I didn't believe her that night, but I stored the sentence somewhere. The following week, I ran into Michael Reeves. Michael was someone I had met briefly at an industry event about 2 years before. We had talked for maybe 20 minutes over bad conference coffee, exchanged cards, connected on LinkedIn, and then done nothing with any of it, the way you do with approximately 70% of the people you meet at conferences. He stopped me outside a coffee shop on a Wednesday morning, recognized me before I recognized him, and asked how I was. I told him honestly that I was between things and looking. He said, "Actually, that's interesting timing. I'm doing some work with a small investment fund, and they've been looking for someone who knows operations consulting from the inside. Not a permanent position, just a consulting engagement. Help them evaluate a few potential acquisitions. Would you be open to having a conversation?" I said yes before I fully registered what I was agreeing to. But that yes, said on a sidewalk outside a coffee shop on an ordinary Wednesday morning, was the beginning of everything that came next. The fund was called Alderton Capital. Small, 4 partners, a focused thesis around regional service businesses, the kind of operation that moves carefully and knows what it's looking for. They needed someone who could look at an operations consulting firm and tell them what they were actually buying. Not just the financials, but the real picture. The client relationships, the team quality, the processes, the places where the business was genuinely strong, and the places where it was being held together with optimism and good presentation. That was exactly what I knew how to do. I had spent 3 years inside a business exactly like the ones they were evaluating. The first engagement went well. I delivered a comprehensive assessment on a firm they were considering in the regional Midwest, flagged 3 significant risks they hadn't identified in their initial review, and recommended a structure that ultimately saved them a meaningful amount on the purchase price when the issues I'd flagged became negotiating points. The partners were specific in their appreciation, which is how people in finance express enthusiasm. They offered me 2 more engagements before the first one was finished. By August, 4 months after I'd sat at Rachel's kitchen table with my head on my arms, I was earning more than I had made at Meridian. Not dramatically more, but more. Working roughly the same hours, with no victor, no public dressings down, and the particular satisfaction of being valued specifically for the thing you are actually good at. I moved back into my own apartment in September. And then, in October, I heard something interesting. It came through the ambient noise of the industry, the conversations at the edges of meetings, the things people mention when they're not specifically trying to tell you something. A contact at another firm mentioned, in passing, that Meridian had lost two of its largest clients in the past quarter. Another person, someone I knew from a professional association, said she had heard there was tension between Meridian's partners and their largest creditor. A third piece of information arrived as a rumor and then solidified when I found a brief mention in an industry newsletter. Meridian Consulting was exploring strategic options. Strategic options. The corporate language for, we're in trouble and we're looking for a way out. I sat with this information for about a week, turned it over, looked at it from different angles, ran some rough numbers based on what I knew about the firm's size and structure and the kinds of multiples that applied in this sector. And then I had a thought that was so large and so strange that I almost laughed at it. I called Michael Reeves. I said, "I have something I want to talk to you about." He said, "I'm free Thursday." I said, "I'll come to you." I spent the 2 days before that meeting preparing with more care and more focus than I had prepared for anything in a long time. Because I understood that what I was about to propose sounded, on its surface, like something a person does in a movie, not something a person does in real life at 30 years old, 11 months after being walked out of a building by a security guard with a cardboard box. But I also understood that I knew Meridian from the inside. I knew its clients, its processes, its team, its weaknesses, and, critically, its potential if it were run by someone who understood what they were doing and valued the people who did the actual work. I knew it better than any outside buyer ever could. And I knew that this knowledge, combined with the right financial partnership, was not a fantasy. It was an asset. I walked into that meeting with a 12-page document and a very clear answer to the question I knew Michael was going to ask, which was, why would anyone sell to you? The answer was, because I'm the only buyer who already knows exactly what they're buying. And I know how to fix it. He read the 12 pages. He looked up. He said, "Give me 2 weeks to talk to my partners." I went home and made dinner and tried to feel normal. I couldn't entirely, but I tried. Michael called me back in 12 days, not 14. He said, "My partners want to meet you. All 4 of them. Can you do Thursday morning?" I said yes, and then spent the next 48 hours doing 2 things simultaneously. Refining every number in my proposal until I could defend each one from any angle, and practicing the particular kind of calm that I needed to walk into that room projecting. Not confidence exactly. Confidence can read as performance when it isn't earned yet. More like certainty. The specific, quiet certainty of someone who has done the work and knows what they found. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. The 4 Alderton partners were different from each other in style, but similar in substance. Precise, skeptical in the productive sense, genuinely interested in being convinced rather than performing skepticism as a negotiating tactic. They asked hard questions about the financials, about the client retention risk, about the key personnel I was planning to keep and why, about what my plan was if one of the major clients walked within the first 90 days. I had answers for all of it. Not because I had guessed right, because I knew Meridian. I had managed 3 of their largest client relationships personally. I knew which clients were loyal to the firm's brand and which ones were loyal to specific people inside the firm. I knew which of those people were likely to stay under new ownership and which ones would leave the moment Victor was gone. And I knew which of those departures would hurt and which ones would quietly make things better. I knew where the bodies were buried, in the operational sense, and I knew which ones actually mattered. By the end of the meeting, the senior partner, a compact, deliberate man named Gerald, who had said the least and listened the most, leaned back in his chair and said, "The thing that concerns me most about this deal is not the financials. It's the optics. You were terminated by this company. Some people are going to see this as personal." I said, "It is personal. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. But personal and irrational are not the same thing. I know this business from the inside. I know exactly where the value is and exactly where the waste is. I know which clients need attention immediately and which ones are solid. I know which operational processes are genuinely functional and which ones exist because nobody ever questioned them. No outside buyer has that. I do. That's not a liability. That's the entire thesis." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Give us the weekend." They called me Monday morning. They were in. What followed was 4 months of the most demanding work I have ever done, and I say that as someone who had spent 3 years at a firm that prided itself on demanding work. Due diligence on a company I was simultaneously intimately familiar with and legally required to approach as an outsider. Financial modeling that accounted for client attrition scenarios ranging from optimistic to genuinely painful. Legal structuring. The deal involved a combination of Alderton's capital and a loan I personally guaranteed, which meant that if things went wrong, they went wrong for me specifically, in a very concrete and uncomfortable way. I worked 12-hour days and sometimes longer. I kept a legal pad on my nightstand for the first 2 months because I would wake up at 3 in the morning having thought of something I needed to check in the morning. My sister, who called me every Sunday, started opening those calls by asking me directly, "Are you eating?" Not as a pleasantry, as a genuine inquiry. But here is the thing about work that comes from a place of real purpose, real conviction, real skin in the game. It doesn't feel the same as ordinary work. It exhausts you differently. You're tired at the end of a 12-hour day, but it's a different quality of tired, the kind that comes with a sense of forward motion underneath it. The kind where the alarm goes off in the morning and there is something you need to do today that matters, and you know what it is, and you get up. I got up every morning for 4 months. And we built something worth signing. Victor found out in February. I don't know exactly how. The deal had been structured carefully, with the layers of confidentiality that these transactions require. But information moves in small industries in ways that are difficult to fully control. Someone talked to someone who talked to someone, and on a Tuesday morning in February, almost exactly 11 months after he had terminated me, Victor Hale learned that the entity making an offer on his company was controlled in part by the woman he had walked out of his building with a cardboard box. His first move was a phone call to Gerald. Gerald told me about it the same afternoon, with the particular neutrality of someone reporting a fact rather than an opinion. He said, "Victor called me this morning. He expressed some concerns about the suitability of the buyer given the prior employment relationship. I told him the financial terms were the terms, and the buyer was the buyer. And if he had concerns about the transaction structure, his counsel could raise them through the appropriate channels." Victor's counsel raised them. Through multiple channels, with more energy than the concerns technically warranted. There were letters about conflict of interest, an argument that didn't have much legal foundation, but generated paperwork and required responses, which cost time and money. There were calls to 2 of Alderton's limited partners, outside investors in the fund, suggesting that the deal had reputational complications that the fund's leadership might not be fully aware of. One of those calls landed on someone who was already cautious about the deal for unrelated reasons, and suddenly, we had a problem. His name was Warren, one of Alderton's 4 partners, the one I had read as slightly less convinced in that first Thursday meeting, the one who had asked the most questions about the client attrition scenarios. Victor's call, or the version of it that reached Warren through whatever chain of telephone, fed something that was already there. Warren called an internal partners meeting. He said he thought they should slow down and reconsider. Michael called me that night. He said, "I want you to know about this before you hear it another way. Warren is asking for a pause. The other three are still with you, but we can't close with a partner dissenting." I sat with that for about 10 minutes. Then I said, "Can I meet with Warren directly?" There was a pause on Michael's end. Then he said, "That's not standard." I said, "I know. Can I?" Another pause. Then, "Let me ask him." Warren agreed to meet. A Thursday morning, his office, 45 minutes. I prepared for it the way I had prepared for very few things in my life. Not just the numbers, not just the strategic case, but the actual human conversation. Because I understood that Warren's hesitation was not really about the financial model. The financial model was solid, and he knew it. His hesitation was about something harder to quantify. Whether the person behind this deal was making a sound business decision or an emotional one. Whether I was a buyer or a woman with a grudge. I sat across from him and I said it plainly. I know what this looks like. I know the story that writes itself easily here. And I'm going to tell you why that story is wrong. Not because I want to convince you that the personal history doesn't exist, but because I want you to see that I have accounted for it, and that accounting for it has made the analysis more rigorous, not less. Because I know every place where my judgment could be compromised by what happened, and I have checked every one of those places twice. I walked him through the methodology. Every client assessment, every personnel evaluation, every financial assumption. I showed him where I had specifically stress tested for my own potential bias and what I found when I did. He listened. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, "I'll be in touch by end of week." He called Thursday evening. He said, "I'm satisfied. Let's close the deal." I thanked him and hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment, doing nothing in particular. Then I called my sister, who screamed for approximately the same duration as Rachel had when I texted her the first paying customer news, which suggested that the women in my life had a consistent response to my professional milestones, and I found this deeply comforting. The signing happened on a Wednesday in March. I dressed carefully that morning. Not to impress anyone. There wasn't anyone in that room whose impression I particularly needed. I dressed carefully because it felt like a day that deserved care. A day that had been a long time arriving and that I wanted to meet properly. My attorney, Sandra, a compact, efficient woman who had been with me through every phase of this process and who had developed over 4 months the particular professional warmth of someone who has been in the trenches with you, drove with me to the building. We didn't talk much in the car. I looked out the window. I thought about the March morning 11 months ago when I had stood on this sidewalk with a box and a wind coming off the street. I thought about Rachel's kitchen table, about 43 applications and 12 responses. About Michael outside the coffee shop on that ordinary Wednesday. The lobby was familiar in the way that places are familiar when you have spent years in them and then left abruptly. Everything in the right place, everything slightly smaller than memory made it. Brianna at the front desk, her 3-expression sequence, her quiet, "It's good to see you." We went upstairs to the conference room. Victor was already there, with his attorney and two of his partners. He looked, if I am being honest, like a man who had not been sleeping well. The particular quality of tiredness that comes from a sustained period of things not going the way you expected. Not the sharp tiredness of one bad night, but the accumulated weight of many of them. He looked at me when I came in. I looked at him. I nodded. He nodded. That was the entirety of our greeting. The signing itself took about 90 minutes. Documents moved around the table, attorneys explained sections, pens moved. Businesslike and precise. The enormous practical machinery of a legal transfer of ownership, which is one of those processes that manages to feel both tremendously significant and completely mundane simultaneously. There was one moment, near the end, when most of the documents had been signed and Sandra had organized them into her folders, and the room was beginning to have the slightly deflated feeling that follows a conclusion. Victor spoke. Not to the room. To me. He said, "I hope you know what you're taking on." It was an interesting thing to say. I thought about several responses. I chose the most honest one. I said, "Better than anyone else in this room. That's exactly why I'm here." He nodded once. Then he looked down at the table. And that was the last significant thing Victor Hale said to me directly. We shook hands. Everyone shakes hands at the end of these things. It's the ritual. It's what you do. And then the room began to empty. Sandra and I took the elevator down together. She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Ask me in a week, when it feels real." She smiled and said, "It already is." I walked out through the lobby. Brianna looked up. I paused at the front desk and I said, "I'll need some time this week to meet with all the teams. Would you put something on the calendar?" She said, "Of course." And then she smiled, openly this time, no containing it. She said, "Welcome back, Ms. Anna." I said, "Thank you. I mean that." And I walked back out through those doors. But this time, I was coming back in a few hours, because now it was mine. I called a company-wide meeting for the following Monday. Not a leadership meeting, not a management briefing. Everyone. All 63 people who remained on staff. I wanted to speak to the entire organization at once, for the same reason I had been direct with Warren, because trying to manage information through layers and filters creates exactly the kind of uncertainty that makes people make decisions based on fear rather than facts. And I had spent 3 years in a culture built on exactly that dynamic, and I had no interest in replicating it. The conference room wasn't big enough for 63 people, so we used the open floor space on the 3rd floor. People stood or sat on the edges of desks. I stood at the front without notes. I had thought about using notes and decided against it. This needed to feel like a conversation, not a prepared statement. I said, "Most of you know who I am, and some of you remember specifically how I left this building. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen or try to reframe it into something more comfortable. It happened. It was handled poorly. I've thought about it a lot in the past year, and what I decided is that the best response to something handled poorly is to build something handled better. That's why I'm here." The room was very quiet. The particular quality of quiet that means people are actually listening, not the quiet of an audience performing attention. I told them what I was planning and what I was not planning. I was not planning a sweep, mass layoffs, systematic purging, anything motivated by anything other than what was good for the business. I was not planning to use this platform for any purpose other than running a better company than the one I had been part of. I was planning to actually talk to people about what worked and what didn't, because I had learned through the due diligence process that there was a significant gap between what leadership had believed about the operational reality and what the operational reality actually was. And I intended to close that gap by the most reliable method available: listening to the people doing the actual work. Then a hand went up in the middle of the room. A man named Patrick, project manager, had been at Meridian for 6 years. Someone I had worked alongside on 2 engagements and remembered as both technically excellent and completely unafraid of saying what he actually thought. He said, "I want to ask you something directly. Are you here to settle scores?" The room went even quieter, which had not seemed possible. I looked at Patrick for a moment. Then I said, "No, and I'll tell you why. Because I think you deserve a real answer rather than a corporate one. Settling scores would mean making decisions based on what happened to me. And making decisions based on what happened to me would mean this company suffers for something that had nothing to do with any of you. I was treated unfairly. Some of you were treated unfairly too, possibly for longer and in ways I wasn't close enough to see. The answer to that is not to redirect the unfairness. The answer is to end it. That's what I'm here to do." Patrick held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Slowly, the way people nod when they've decided to believe something provisionally and will be watching to see if it holds. I said, "I know trust is earned. I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking you to give me the next 90 days to show you something real. After that, make your own assessment." The meeting ended. People went back to their desks. No one applauded, which was fine. I hadn't been looking for applause. But in the days that followed, something in the temperature of the place began to shift. Small things. The way people spoke in the hallways. The quality of the questions in my first round of one-on-one meetings. The particular aliveness of a team that is starting to believe, tentatively, that something might actually be different this time. Patrick stopped by my office on Thursday. He said, "That was the right answer." I said, "I meant it." He said, "I know. That's why it was the right answer." It has been 14 months since that Monday morning meeting. I'm sitting at a desk in what used to be Victor's office. I moved the furniture around considerably and replaced the large portrait of Victor that had hung on the wall with a whiteboard, which I find more useful. And I'm looking out through the glass wall at a floor that has 67 people on it now. 4 more than when I arrived, because we have grown enough to need them. The culture is different. I want to be careful about how I say that, because culture change is one of those things that gets announced dramatically and then either actually happens or doesn't, and the proof is in the mundane details rather than the declarations. So let me give you mundane details. People say when something isn't working. Not in a culture of fear, not with career risk attached. They say it in meetings. They put it in writing. They come to my door and say it directly. I have had 3 separate conversations in the past 2 months where a team member told me something I had gotten wrong. And in all 3 cases, they were right. And we fixed it. And nothing bad happened to them as a result of being right. That's it. That's culture change. It's that small and that important. The 2 largest clients that I had assessed as loyal to the firm rather than to Victor are still with us. One of them expanded their engagement in the fall. The client I had assessed as the highest attrition risk departed in the 6th month. I had known this was likely and had already begun building the replacement revenue before they left, which meant the departure was painful but not destabilizing. Patrick is leading his own team now. He is exactly as technically excellent and unafraid of saying what he actually thinks as I remembered him being. And both of those things turn out to be enormously useful in a leadership role when the culture actually supports them. Alderton Capital is a good partner. Gerald, the quiet one who said, "Give us the weekend," sends me thoughtful questions every quarter and gets out of the way in between. That is the right balance. I am grateful for it. And Victor. Victor is running a smaller consultancy now. I heard this through the industry network, not from him directly. We have not spoken since the closing. I don't wish him harm. I don't particularly wish him well either, if I'm being honest. I think about him less than I expected to, which itself tells me something. The person who occupied so much of my mental real estate for 3 years, who had the power to make or break the day before I even arrived at the office, turned out to matter much less to my actual life than the role I had assigned him. That's one of the things you learn when you come out the other side of something like this. The people who feel enormous in the middle of it are often much smaller by the time you're standing somewhere they cannot reach. I want to close with something I have been thinking about for a while, because I think it's the most important thing in this story, and it has nothing to do with the acquisition or the business or any of the external events. The 17 minutes. That's what it started with. A subway delay. 17 minutes. A decision that one person made about my value based on a morning that had nothing to do with my value. And if you had told me, standing on that sidewalk with my box, that the 17 minutes were the beginning of something, rather than the end of something, I would not have believed you. I was not capable of believing you. I was standing in what felt very much like wreckage. But the wreckage was not the end. The wreckage was the terrain I had to build on, and it turned out to be solid ground. Here is what I know now that I did not know then. Being dismissed by someone, truly dismissed, publicly, in a way that was designed to diminish you, does one of two things. It either becomes the story you tell about yourself, the defining moment that sets the ceiling on what you believe you're capable of, or it becomes fuel. Raw, uncomfortable, sometimes difficult to manage fuel. But fuel. The kind that burns clean when you point it at something worth building. The difference between those two outcomes is not talent. It's not luck, though luck plays a role. It's the decision you make at some point about which story this is. Whether this is the story of what was done to you, or whether this is the story of what you built afterward. You get to make that decision. Whatever has happened, whatever someone has said about your value or your potential, or your right to take up space in their organization or their vision of the future, you get to make that decision. They don't. If someone showed you the door, really showed you the door, with a box and a security escort and an audience, I want you to hear this. That door goes both ways. You can come back through it. Not as the person you were when you left, as the person you became while you were figuring out what to do next. That is a version of you they are completely unprepared for. Drop a comment if this story reached something in you. If you've been handed a box, or if you're in the middle of figuring out what comes after. I want to hear from you. Every single comment. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.